Hi there, good afternoon. I want to thank you for joining us for Hide Seek, Portraits for LGBTQ plus Pride Month, the inaugural installment of the Tommy L. Pegues and Donald A. Capocha Conversation Series. I'm Gwendolyn Du Bois Shaw. I'm the Senior Historian at the National Portrait Gallery, and I'm the Director of Portal, the Portrait Gallery Scholarly Center. Because we will be showing images as part of today's presentation, we recommend that you select the gallery active speaker or thumbnail view at the top right corner of your screen in order to better see our panelists. And we also have closed captioning being provided by a colleague. So if you're interested in seeing subtitles, you can turn that on as well. There will be a Q&A function where you can submit questions for our speakers. Before beginning today's program, I would also like to invite you to join us again on Tuesday, July 7th at 5 p.m. On Zoom for the Greenberg-Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture, which will feature artist Jeffrey Gibson and Maria Magdalena Campos Pons in conversation with National Portrait Gallery curator Dorothy Moss. And Jackie, can I have the next slide, please? Great, thanks, Jackie. They will be discussing artistic strategies for reinserting Black, Indigenous, and people of color histories into museum spaces through live performance and object creation. With tonight's program, we will begin a year-long discussion marking the 10-year anniversary of the landmark exhibition Hide Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture. When Hide Seek premiered in October of 2010, it became the first major museum exhibition to take on the issue of LGBTQ plus subjectivity in portraiture. It was also at the center of a national controversy when one of the pieces, David Wojnarowicz's video Fire in My Belly, was ordered to be taken down by the Secretary of the Smithsonian after social conservatives and religious groups objected. Needless to say, the censorship controversy fueled interest in the exhibition, and nearly 750,000 people came to see it during its run. And later in the summer, we'll have a special panel about the controversy that was generated. So I hope you come back and join us for that. The exhibition went on to be named the best thematic exhibition nationally by the US section of the International Association of Art Critics. The catalog was awarded the Stonewall Israel Fishman Nonfiction Award from the Rainbow Roundtable of the American Library Association. And most recently, Hyperallergic named Hide Seek one of the top 10 exhibitions of the decade. We are pleased that the exhibition's co-curators, David Ward and Jonathan Katz, are able to join us tonight to discuss this important exhibition, how it came together, and what its legacy is today, and also to talk about some of the art that was included in it. But first, I would like to introduce you to Tommy Pegues, who has served as one of the National Portrait Gallery's commissioners since 2015, and his partner, Donald Capocha. Together, they have been valued supporters of the MPG since 2008, and we are especially grateful for their support of Hide Seek. Since then, Tommy and Donald have provided much appreciated support, enabling us to further our mission, and we extend our gratitude for their continued generosity and for making this new virtual conversation series on issues in LGBTQ plus portraiture possible. I'm going to unmute them. Just a second.
Unmute.
Okay, you're unmuted now. So I'm very pleased that they're both joining us today and that they have agreed to say a few words. So I'll give it to you, Tommy and Donald.
Thank you, Gwendolyn. Hi, everyone. It has been a true honor to serve on the commission of the National Portrait Gallery and learn from curators, historians, and educators. I don't have to tell you that these past few weeks have been especially challenging. When the Portrait Gallery director, Kim Sayette, called me with the idea to do something, essentially making a safe space available for discussing critical issues around the LGBTQ plus identity and artistic production, Dawn and I were thrilled. We immediately knew we had to get involved. Conversations such as the one that we'll be having today are pertinent to expand our shared understanding of our communities, our country, and each other.
When Hide Seek opened in 2010, the Portrait Gallery gave me and so many others a place to contemplate certain facets of creative expression that had been suppressed by other large arts institutions. We were grateful for the perspective shared and for the spotlight that the show gave to the LGBTQ plus community. Here we are 10 years later, we continue to discuss many of the same issues and concerns, yet we also celebrate the progress that's been made. So thank you all for being here, for your interest in this topic, your curiosity, and for joining us in the belief that portraiture is powerful, and happy Pride. Gwendolyn, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you both. And now I'm going to introduce our speakers for tonight. Jonathan D. Katz. There are a lot of you out there, so I want to distinguish. Jonathan D. Katz is a widely published art historian, curator, and queer activist. Actually, there's only one Jonathan. I have to correct that. Having taught previously at Yale and SUNY Buffalo, he is now Associate Professor of Practice in Art History and Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Katz has curated numerous exhibitions, including About Face, Stonewall Revolt and New Queer Art, Art AIDS America, and Hide Seek. He also co-founded the Queer Caucus for Art, Queer Nation in San Francisco, the Harvey Milk Institute, and is President Emeritus of the Leslie Lohman Museum for Queer Art in New York City. David C. Ward retired as Senior Historian at the National Portrait Gallery in 2017, and I hold his old position, so I have everything to, I owe everything to David in many ways, including all the work I do now. In addition to Hide Seek, he curated exhibitions on, among other topics, the poet Walt Whitman, President Abraham Lincoln, Generals Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, modern American poets, as well as the portrayal of the American working class. He's also published 2 books of poetry and writes widely on Anglo-American poets in verse. And Jackie, if you give us the next slide, it goes into the first question to start this conversation, which I'll give to you, David. I understand that Walt Whitman had a lot to do with how you and Jonathan first met and how you began to embark on the collaboration that ultimately resulted in Hide Seek. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that happened and what role Whitman played in the origins of Hide Seek. Oh, hang on a second. Okay, David, I'm unmuting you.
Thanks, Gwen. Hi, Don, Tom, good to see you again. Yeah, the origins from my point of view of Hide Seek were serendipitous, or if you want, synergistic. The Portrait Gallery in the decade of the aughts was coming off a major rebuilding of the actual building, during which we were at the same time restructuring our thinking about art, portraiture, identity, self-fashioning, all those good things. And when we reopened, I did a show called Walt Whitman, A Cosmos. And I was interested in Whitman as the first American modernist, and I was interested in how he used photography to project himself into the American consciousness as he did with his words. And it was a smallish show, and I had this picture in it of Walt Whitman and Peter Doyle, and Walt Whitman and his lover of 8 years, Peter Doyle. It's essentially a wedding or a courtship portrait. They'd met in Washington in 1863. These 2 hairy guys, they're wearing their hats. Whitman always wore his hat cocked indoors and out as he pleased. And I put it on the wall, not thinking too much about it. And the first sentence of the label is, "This is Walt Whitman and his lover of 8 years, Peter Doyle." And went away, and the show opened. And about a month later, Jonathan Katz, who I did not know, but who was in town on a fellowship, came up to me at some event and asked me about the picture and said, "Did you get in trouble for writing that label?" And I said, "No. In fact, I'm not sure anybody besides you has apparently read it." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because that's the first time that relationship has been openly acknowledged in a major American museum." And I was gobsmacked. And from that evolved a conversation around 2 things from my point of view. Was, first of all, as a somewhat naive, although I shouldn't have been at that point, I was in my 50s, person that museums would exclude certain information about people's biography, which animated me, but also the element of marginality, that Whitman as an outsider would have a truer, more accurate, more creative take on mainstream America. And from that conversation, Yuval Jonathan was in the position of Diogenes looking for an honest museum. And he realized that he had found a sucker in me because I was fascinated by this. And Jonathan, of course, was ready to be shot out of a cannon because he had the, and I mean that, I do mean the pun there. He had the show which he had been pitching to American museums for some time, all ready to, essentially ready to go. And I'll turn it over to Jonathan in terms of the conceptualization of the show, but my involvement is the inside man, if you will. You know, although I was more than just a bureaucrat on this show, was this strange coincidence that of through this picture of these two hairy bears back in Civil War Washington, bringing the two of us together to create this interpretation of modern American art, culture, and LGBT community.
Yeah, so Jonathan, you were already prepared with an exhibition idea, huh? It had been peddled around and had been rolling about in your fertile brain for a while before running into David?
Yes, exactly. And what I really wanted to do was to create an exhibition that was actually filled with great American painting that foregrounded questions of sexuality, but would be in some sense indistinguishable from a show of canonical American painting, because the canon of American art and the canon of queer artists is so often identical. And can we see the first image? This is really striking because what we have here is a painting by, you know, one of the founding figures in American art, Thomas Eakins, and it was in our exhibition with Pride of Place. But what's amazing about it is that the image dates from 1898. The word homosexual was coined in 1889, and I'm sorry, 1869 in Hungarian. It wasn't in wide use in English in 1898, only doctors would have known it. So in some sense, we're looking at a painting that is in advance of the very term. And one of the striking things about it is that Eakins has found a way to enlist us in the picture. You'll notice that there's a spiral around the central figure, and that central figure is named Turkey Point Billy Smith. That was his fighting moniker. It's not the most macho, I'll grant you, but it's a very queer kind of boxing picture because, of course, the whole point of boxing picture was to show masculine aggression. And here we have a boxing picture that instead shows a young man's ephebic, hairless body waving at a crowd in which clearly his buttocks are the epicenter of attention. And not only are people in the audience looking at his butt, but we have been enlisted, whether we want to look at his butt or not, so that we're part of that circle too. So Eakins has found a way to insert a homoerotic gaze, whatever our sexualities.
So are those two, and so are those two attendants, right? You know, their gaze
absolutely.
is directed downward also.
Absolutely.
And the respectable gentleman in the front row.
Yes, indeed.
Checking out the front and the back there.
Can we see the next one, Jackie? But it's really, in some sense, this picture that I thought really catalyzed one of the key arguments of the exhibition, which is that in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, gay and straight weren't unfamiliar with each other the way they became. In fact, they were absolutely integrated. And in a space like this one, which is a shower bath, which would have been the kind of place that you went once a week to take a bath because most people didn't have hot water, you would see inevitably homosexuals. And one of the striking things about this is that what we have in front and center in this print from 1917, I should add one of Bellows's most successful prints, is a homoerotic engagement. You'll see that one guy is the classic queer, hands on his hip, leering grin, mustache, buttocks thrown backwards. And the other guy, a picture of impassive masculinity, nonetheless has, shall we agree to just call it, an unusually starched towel. And here they are, front and center in this print. And what it helps us to understand is that in the early 20th century, there was a very different model of sexuality than the one that we have today. If you acted in accordance with the dictates of your gender, so if you were a man and you were the active partner, it didn't matter what your partner's gender, you were acting in accordance with your gender, so you were straight. And conversely, right, the queer here, because he is violating the canons of his gender, is, of course, queer. What this means is that whereas today we think of you as homosexual if your partner is of the same sex, in this picture, we can see that they understood sexuality as actually a product of your own gender in the sexual act.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
No, you know, also in this picture, I think it's so interesting how it kind of, you know, brings the historical moment, you know, into the contemporary one. I remember in the 1980s with the rise of the AIDS epidemic, all of the bathhouses, you know, being closed down in San Francisco and New York City. And there's still a little bit of bathhouse culture, I think, that, you know, that remains and or has resurged, you know. And so it must have been, you know, really great, you know, to be able to show an image like this as a way to connect a distant past from 1917 into a contemporary moment.
Absolutely. And it also helps us to understand, you know, we often have this sort of arrogance of the presence in which we think, why didn't they in the early 20th century create gay neighborhoods and great gay museums and gay newspapers and all the stuff of gay culture that we have? And in fact, they didn't do it because they didn't need to do it. Gay and straight needed each other. They were interwoven in a way that isn't true today. Can we see the next one, Jackie? But I also am very proud of the fact that 10 years ago, we were really invested in an intersectional politics, which is to say the relationship between, for example, questions of race and questions of sexuality. So here we have an advertisement for the #1 race record of 1928, Ma Rainey's Prove It On Me Blues. And the backstory here is fascinating. Ma Rainey in 1925 got busted for holding a lesbian orgy in her apartment. And and a large woman, she got caught because she fell down the staircase. And they didn't even
This sounds like a wild party.
It was a totally wild party. And they didn't even have the category lesbian party. So they charged her as the madam of a house of prostitution.
Oh, wow.
And remarkably, like Madonna would decades later, she uses sex to sell records. So Prove It On Me Blues tells us this whole incident because that's Ma Rainey, the large woman in the mannish outfit, chatting up two svelte young women while two cops in the background are looking at her, wondering what's going on. And the lyrics were totally
so the cops are over there in the corner,
exactly,
leaning against the fence.
And the lines are, you know, the chorus is, they say I do it, ain't nobody caught me, y'all gotta prove it on me. Can we see the next, please?
Well, hang on a second. You mentioned that it was a race record.
Yeah, so this is the one of the striking things about this moment is that the African-American community had a separate, I mean, this was a deeply segregated moment, had its separate record production. And so this was the #1 record in the African-American community at the time, which underscores the degree to which Black culture had a very different relationship to queerness than dominant culture at this time. And in fact, one of the arguments we make in the show is that a lot of white folk went to Harlem for the first time because they could drink, because there were clubs, but there they experienced a liberated culture that was simply not available in dominant white America at the time. And that was a spur to their own liberation. Can we see the next one? And here is an example of it. I mean, admittedly, a very sort of colonialist portrait. This is Carl von Vechten, the great popularizer of Harlem. And if you look carefully, the artist Romaine Brooks has actually put behind him a whole series of African-American male faces. And that's because he was himself interested in African-American men. And so his investment in Harlem was in part because there he was free to be who he was in a way that he wasn't in dominant culture at the time.
I want to point out an ominous detail to the background of that picture that if you look at it, it's a little hard to see in the reproduction, but the lattice work against which the black figures are posed looks very much like the lattice work that you'd see from above on a slave ship.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're really emerging from the background and kind of, you know, in that murky space.
The shadowy netherworld, and then of course there's no more hellish world in the slave ship.
Right, and he's all white, and they're literally fading to black. I mean, the race is very much part of this picture. Can we see the next? So it's hard for us to imagine, but this is a moment that did not yet have any kind of terms for the representation of lesbianism. In fact, there was such a wider latitude for women to touch one another by virtue of being friends or family, that the problem that the lesbian photographer Berenice Abbott had was, how do you show lesbianism that's unmistakably lesbianism? And here she answers that with a photo of Janet Flaner, who was a journalist, very famous journalist for the New Yorker in Paris, with masks placed on her top hat. And those masks, of course, lifted off the face, create a kind of metaphor for self-exposure at a moment when even the terms out of the closet was not in wide use. Can we see the next, please? And this, I think, is one of the more remarkable images in the show, because what O'Keeffe has done is taken the very symbol of masculine erotic presence, the goat horn, the priapus, right? And turned it from an extension into a void. She's given us the goat horn, in other words, as the image of an empty center. And in case we miss, right, the way in which she's challenging its masculinist pretense, she even does it in red in the interior, lending it this sort of feminine aura. Can we see the next, please? And this is actually, as far as I'm able to ascertain, the earliest political work in American portraiture. And in some sense, the mark of something very, very different. I was trying to say that earlier, gay and straight were absolutely interwoven. But by this point, 1951, there is the beginning of a real cleavage between the gay and straight communities, in part because the federal government is beginning to engage in witch hunts against queers. And here, the artist Jess, who was originally actually a member of the Federal Atomic Energy Research Group, but he was an atomic scientist, abandons that and becomes an artist. And he takes images from what are called posing strap magazines, and he builds a figure out of them. So this is a collage of posing strap figures, sort of softcore gay porn, and they form a figure posing in a mirror, but the mirror is made out of clowns' heads, and it ends in a noose. And you'll see that there's a little squiggle at the bottom of that noose, and that is actually the first instance, or one of the early instances, of concrete poetry from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. It's The Mouse's Tale. And it reads, "No need for a trial. I'll be the judge. I'll be the jury. I'll try the case, and I'll sentence you to death." So here we have a classic instance of this man seeking to see himself reflected, but all the clowns can do is condemn him to death. And this 1951. Can we see the next, please?
And can you say, can you go back quick,
Sure.
Jackie? Yeah. Can you say a little bit about Jess and, you know, why he came to this moment?
Yes, Jess really is one of the more fascinating figures because he became involved with a very important American poet, and they were out starting in the early 1950s. And as I mentioned, Jess was associated with the Livermore Laboratories, and he came to realize that his research resulted in the atomic bomb. And he decided he didn't want to have any part of that. And so he quits atomic research and becomes an artist and becomes a stalwart critic of dominant culture.
Mhm.
Let me see the next. So here we have Beaufort Delaney's amazing image of James Baldwin. And I think what's striking about this very young Baldwin is that he has deliberately given him, it seems to me, a kind of effeminized look that actually photographs of Baldwin don't have. But he's trying to telegraph Baldwin's sexuality as well as, right, those extraordinary intelligent eyes.
Mm-hmm. And so both Delaney and Baldwin were gay, right?
Right, exactly, exactly.
And, you know, I mean, Delaney loved that color, yellow, right? That was his signature color. And when you see portraits by him, we just had a Marian Anderson One Life exhibition at the Portrait Gallery this past year. And there was a beautiful portrait that Delaney made of Anderson that was also in yellow. And, you know, thinking the ways that different artists connect up with colors and certain subjects, and the respect for the color, the respect for the subject, kind of, you know, threading it through the notable colleagues of the period.
Absolutely. And yellow, of course, has such an aggressive color, fitting his politics, I think.
Mm.
Can we see the next, please? So this is a much later work by the artist Glenn Ligon, who, of course, is using runaway slave posters as the model. And what he's done is he's described himself as other people describe him. You know, we're never in charge of our own identities. Our identities are always, of course, refracted through people all around us. They tell us who we are. And here, Ligon is, of course, building an image of himself premised on what other people have described. And, of course, drawing a connection between, this is a 1993 work, between his identity as an African-American artist today and the long history of African-American servitude.
Mm-hmm. And this is part of a whole series that he did, right? Where
Exactly.
he had different people describe him. So this one says, you know, Glenn, a black male, 5'8", very short hair, nearly completely shaved, stocky build, right? You know, it mentions certain things.
And often questions of complexion come up. Here he's referred to as slightly orange. Other ones say that he's dark, other ones say that he's light. So it really plays with the whole idea of the value of coloration itself.
As though it was something that could be fixed, right?
Yeah.
If you could just find the right language for it to pin down that identity.
And of course,
Exactly.
they use the same stock character of the runaway man with the bag, the hobo bag. So that you have the variegated language of the text, which frequently got into details about discipline and everything else. But then, and partly this was a matter of the 19th century technology. You know, a slave was a slave, it didn't matter.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, the interchangeable print block.
Yeah, it didn't matter, it's just a slave, right?
Exactly. Can we see the next, please?
Yeah.
So this is really one of the iconic images in the show. Jasper Johns's In Memory of My Feelings, Frank O'Hara. The model is a poem by Frank O'Hara in which he describes his feelings at the end of a love affair. And indeed, this is the painting that Johns makes upon breaking up with his partner, Robert Rauschenberg. They'd been together for over 6 years at this time. And what's remarkable is that that relationship was inaugurated pictorially with Jasper Johns' single most famous image, the American flag. So if you look at this picture, you can see that this is, as it were, a kind of negation of the American flag. He takes that image, right, of the blue stars and he makes it an empty gray field. But it's also a picture that's divided in half. You can actually see that there's hinges right down the center of the canvas. So it folds in on itself, a beautiful metaphor for queer identity at the time. But most centrally, you'll also notice that there's a fork and a spoon tied together with wire hanging down on one side. That's the side from before the end of the relationship, when they're still together. And if you look on the far right of the other side, you'll notice that the fork and the spoon have been separated. It's barely visible that you can see the fork and the spoon separated on the right, but it is present. And underneath, we know this because we x-rayed the work, underneath the paint on that side is a skull and crossbones and the words "dead man." So this is a painting really in which he reflects on the end of the relationship, essentially before the end and after the end. And he is deeply worried that he's going to lose the ability to speak, to have any kind of voice, because when he had Rauschenberg, he had an audience that knew how to read what he was saying.
I'd like to also just point out that the first line in the Frank O'Hara poem is, "My silence has a man in it."
Exactly, exactly.
Which I actually thought you couldn't do it, but I always thought that would have been a good title for the whole show.
Yeah. Next, please. And of course, inevitably, the show moved into AIDS and its representations, but we wanted very much to turn back the sort of pathos. And Mapplethorpe's self-portrait, I think, does that brilliantly. Because, of course, at this moment, he is but a few months, actually, from his demise at this point. He's got wasting syndrome. He's quite weak. But nonetheless, he holds this skull cane in his hands in this almost imperial gesture, staring out at us with a disembodied face, as if to be a memento mori, a reminder of death, saying, "Oh, you think, right, bad that I am about to die. Look what's happening to you. You're going to die too." So he takes our pitying gaze and he throws it back at us. And it's that kind of activist energy that I wanted this image to communicate. Next, please. And then I think one of the most singularly important works in the last quarter of the 20th century, the Cuban immigrant Felix Gonzalez Torres's amazing Untitled. He uses Untitled for all of his titles, but he always appends to it, in parentheses, a more directed meaning, Portrait of Ross in LA, which tells us that the weight of these candies is equal to the weight of his then partner, Ross Laycock, at his healthiest weight. And then what?
So this is that ideal weight.
The ideal weight.
175 pounds. Okay. And all the candy wrapped up in the corner weighs 175 to begin with.
Right. And you can put it in any format you want. Gonzalez doesn't specify how you're to hang it, as it were. But what's striking is he does tell you that you have to tell visitors that they can have a piece of candy.
I have to say that I did about 1 million tours of Hide-Seek, and I would explain all this to them, and that they were integral to the process of the work of art's creation. And people were incredibly reluctant and resistant to taking the candy.
Yeah, yeah.
It was unbelievable. It was like I had,
Yeah. Or when people take them, like then they won't eat them, right? Then they save
you're
it.
supposed to eat them in an element of communion, but they wouldn't take them.
And what's really amazing about this is that when you take the candy, if you eat it, you actually participate with the artist in a political statement. Number one, of course, this is a moment in which AIDS has always been othered. Other people have AIDS. In fact, the whole discourse around AIDS was to absolutely other fellow human beings. So it is an act of communion. It's also literally, right, communion, because it echoes the Catholic ritual, right, of putting the body of Christ into your mouth. And finally, it overturns that central belief at the time that AIDS was eminently communicable. And here you are literally putting it into your mouth. And not least, and I think most centrally, as we eat that candy, we cause his ideal weight, his body, to decrease. And so we come to understand our direct implication in his disappearance. We can no longer other AIDS. We have to acknowledge our role. I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah. So when you were conceiving the exhibition and putting together this argument, bringing us through, you know, a whole century, century plus of American art, did you have precedents to draw on? What had been exhibited before? Was there anything like this that had been done that you had participated in or that you were modeling your concept on?
Well, certainly nothing with regard to portraiture. There had been a few exhibitions, one in California of queer art, another one in New York, but they were smaller exhibitions. There was the work of the New Museum, which did amazing work around AIDS under the curator Bill Olander, who sadly passed from AIDS. But I think what I was really trying to do was a broad rereading of American art history in which we could finally hear sexuality being spoken along with everything else. I wanted to create an exhibition in which we would come to understand the degree to which the image of sexual difference and of the American, right, the greatness of the American art canon were pretty much the same.
Yeah, and so with the next slide, a bridge too far, huh? So this is,
Well,
these are some stills from the David Wojnarowicz video, A Fire in My Belly, which was pulled from the exhibition after some complaints.
Right. And, you know, we came to understand subsequently that this was a cooked controversy, that it had been long in the making, that it was the product of almost a month of communication between radio, television, and members of the Republican Party. And they did something remarkable. They wanted to object to the show, but they realized that they could no longer say, as they once did, homosexuality is sinful, therefore you shouldn't do it. So they had to change their...
You're over-optimistic there.
What?
Well, I think you're a little over-optimistic there.
Maybe. Well, they still believed it was sinful, but they knew they couldn't say it. So what they did was actually change their tack and talk now about anti-Christian propaganda. They said that this work was anti-Christian. And what's remarkable is that it's, I think, absolutely the most Christian piece in the entire exhibition. It's a piece in which the artist, David Wojnarowicz, goes to Mexico after receiving the diagnosis of his good friend, Peter Hujar, and his own, and creates a piece at the moment that Mexico is celebrating Day of the Dead. Because Day of the Dead, of course, with its constant invocation of deceased ancestors, is about the connection between the living and the dead integrated into everyday life, which we in the United States don't do. And there's a perfect metaphor as well politically for Wojnarowicz's perspective in that image of a man standing on a bridge, hammering down the concrete upon which he stands. A beautiful way to think about AIDS. And then another image here of the globe on fire. But there was also 12 seconds of film of ants crawling on a crucifix. And it was that image that became so politically charged. Now, I should say their interpretation of it is 100% wrong. In fact, right, it's Christ as an emblem of the least powerful among us, the most traditionally Christian representation there is. If you were going to get rid of that, then you'd have to close the Vatican Museum.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it played well politically. And unfortunately, though the museum, the National Portrait Gallery, had worked out a whole series of protocols to how to handle conflict, the secretary of the Smithsonian paid no attention to that and just excised this image from the show, leading to a lot of protests.
Yeah. So David, could you talk a little bit about both, you know, this reaction, but the process of bringing Hide-Seek to the public? You know, first you had to go out and ask for loans for the exhibition. And you know, initially, were there travel venues that were signed on? Did that change?
No,
You know, how did the controversy affect it?
No, I mean, that's the interesting thing, is that we couldn't get anybody to take it until the controversy erupted. It became a cause célèbre, and we were fortunate enough to get venues in Brooklyn and in Tacoma. I just want to double back a little bit again, since to thank Tom and Don, who were our initial donors. The support that we got early on was gratifying. One of the reasons this exhibition was a success is that we were able to fundraise for it very quickly. And I won't assume that some people didn't loan works of art to us because they didn't like the theme. I think a couple did. On the other hand, we also heard from, I believe, a Philadelphia museum who said that we have to support this show because a lot of places won't. And so we were happy to get that. And what I'm, you know, 10 years after, I'm still again staggered by the quality and of the artwork that we were able to obtain, and use it in a way that you know, it wasn't minor works of art. It wasn't things. It was, as Jonathan said, the DNA strand of American modernism from Salutat through to the big Ligon, which we haven't shown. And again, it's almost an atavistic response on my part, having lived with this show for 2 years and doing the tours that I did for it or writing the catalog. I was always just struck by the enormity of the creative work that was on display there. That, you know, Emily Dickinson has this great phrase that great art is what makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. And whenever I went, and it's happening to me right now just talking about it, but whenever I went into Hide-Seek to do a tour, I would get that feeling of exaltation. It's just, particularly the main room with the Jasper Johnses. I had a friend who was an artist in Brooklyn who came down to see the show, and I took her through it, and she stood in the middle of the section where the Johns and the Rauschenbergs were. I should say parenthetically, one of the big problem, it's not a problem, one of the omissions in this exhibition, which we had to explain, was we never got a big Rauschenberg combine. We had magnificent Johnses, but we didn't have commensurate Rauschenbergs. So my friend stood in the middle of this circular display space and just twirled around. And as she did, she started to weep. And just said, it's just so beautiful. And that impact, which of what you could do with portraiture. I mean, it was certainly new to me. I mean, I'm a kind of Anglo-American empiricist with an interest in class. And class structure and power, but what you could do in the way that the old American studies movement did with literature, and what you could do with art in order to reinterpret American society and American democracy, was really a revelation to me. And thanks to everybody. I mean, I'm looking at the screen right now, the Marsden Hartley over in the corner. The works of art in this show were just staggering. And I come back again in terms of the support we got. We did a fundraiser, an event in New York, and rest in peace, Larry Kramer. Larry Kramer was there. He wasn't the main speaker, but Larry Kramer's Larry Kramer, so he was going to speak. And after we did our pitch, he stood forward and said, "We have to do this show. This is our history." And when I heard that as an outsider to this process, it's like I heard two things: that yeah, the element of our history is LGBT history. It's an identity show. It's a point of, and again, a pun, pride. but it's also our history, it's America's history. And that was the thing that the protests resisted. The protesters who objected to the Water-Rovich resisted. They resisted that you could voice another view of America, or you could voice a view of America which was as America as apple pie, but it would be done by people that you reviled, that you hated. And you couldn't cope with that. You couldn't cope with the fact that David Water-Rovich, lapsed Catholic, was identifying with the suffering Christ, that he wanted that absolution that came on the cross. And he was desperate for it. And those stories are the stories that the Portrait Gallery has been trying to tell, certainly since 2010. And I think Hide-Seek and its lenders and supporters like Tom and Don and others, my friend Kat Dawson, those people have all been integral in essentially modernizing the National Portrait Gallery.
Yeah, and audiences really responded so strongly to this exhibition. One of our attendees wrote in the question box, "I remember the Jasper Johns being so vivid and powerful in person. Why visiting a museum is meaningful."
Yeah. No, I mean, I had, again, my vow, again, in doing this was that my resolution was I would not say no to any tour. That people would call up and they would want a tour, and it was the Blade, the gay newspaper in town, did a tour, and I said, "How many people do you have?" And they said 150, and I said, "Okay, I'll do the tour."
You took 150 people through?
Yeah, they.
Wow.
I said, "This is going to be a radio."
At once, not broken into groups of 10.
It was like 150, and I said, "This is going to be a radio tour. I'm going to move around and talk, and you're going to just hear me listen. So pretend it's 1938 and there's no television, because you're not going to see any visual imagery here." But it all worked out. And again, the crowds, the enthusiasm. The problem, it's not a problem. It's just that the show exists now on two levels. It exists as an argument. Jonathan's very cogent, well-constructed, brilliant argument about American culture and gay culture at odds and then intertwining, but then it exists as an element of the culture wars, and I'm sorry that we didn't get a little more living space where we could engage with the argument about the Bellows, or the argument about Eight Bill's Folly, or the argument about Salutat. Jonathan and I are intellectuals. We like to have a good argument about the substance of the meaning of these portraits, but we got hit by this, we got blindsided in early November, and then it became a political argument, which I mean, again, I understand it, and I'm happy to fight it out on those grounds too.
And David, if I could just quickly add, one of the things that was really striking about this was that what got lost in the controversy, because a lot of people aimed arrows at the Smithsonian, is that a public institution took the risk in the first place, whereas, wealthy museums that are powerful and have boards of directors that can come up with vastly more resources than the Smithsonian can, took a pass.
Yeah.
So it's ironic that a public museum exposed itself to political controversy, whereas sort of more private museums refused.
Right, but it's ironic, but it's also what the Smithsonian should be doing. That should be what the Smithsonian should be doing. The Smithsonian is the National Museum. The National Museum doesn't mean the National Museum of Kitsch and nice stories that we tell to kittens. It's the National Museum to deal with the complexities of American society and history, the good and the bad, and particularly at this specific moment in our history, it's a reckoning on race that we're going to have to come to, as same as there's a reckoning on queerness that we've had to come to. And we also have to, again, ask ourselves, who gets to speak in these walls? Who gets to be in the National Portrait Gallery? It's not just going to be the president's bearded men and one or two women. It's going to be other Americans, and it's going to be artwork which you may not be comfortable with. It may not just be Anglo-American empirical portraiture. It may be modernist portraiture. It may be postmodernist portraiture. It may even be visual art. And all those things attest to the vitality of American democratic culture in a way that the Smithsonian must support going forward. Now is the time, with the Smithsonian being closed, tragically, is for a necessary rethink about what does the Smithsonian mean to American culture. Is it going to just mimic the kind of shibboleths of America, or is it going to become an institution which can be a true partner with the story of the creation of American democratic culture and American democratic politics?
Mm-hmm. So have things improved? You know, are other museums outside of Portrait Gallery, are they more open now to sexuality and identity? Has there been a lasting impact on the national conversation?
I think, and David and I may disagree on this a little bit.
I don't know.
But I think not.
No, I agree. I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree with you there.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I use the anecdote that my niece in New York City went to the Grant Wood exhibition. Grant Wood was in this exhibition, Arnold Comes of Age. And I mean, Grant Wood was a gay Midwesterner, a proud gay Midwesterner, and the curator of the show in New York said, well, we don't really know about his sexuality. And Katie, my niece, was going, oh, yes, we do.
In fact, one of the
they wouldn't admit it. It was like, well, we're not going to talk about that.
And we included Bellows and a lot of historical material about Bellows. We included two works by Bellows. And one of the things that we made clear was that Bellows was heterosexual, but he was interested in queerness because he was a member of the Ashcan School, which was interested in the social margins of all kinds around race, class, immigration status, etc. And so queers, of course, were part of that. When they did a big Bellows show, we said, hey, maybe now's the time to talk about his interest in representation of gays along with all the others. And what we were told was that they were not interested. They wouldn't talk about it. And this is an artist who's straight and dead, and still you can't talk about it.
Yeah, important to police those boundaries, you know, of the identity for some scholars to do that. You know, in this moment, I'm going to kind of combine a couple of questions that have come in, you know, the kind of state of our union right now with protests, coronavirus, et cetera. You know, we've seen in the last couple of weeks this, you know, magnificent, you know, protest in Brooklyn around Black trans lives, you know, mattering, et cetera. Do you see the direction of art in the LGBTQ plus community? Has it, do you see it having changed since the exhibition, and particularly at this moment, are you noticing anything in particular?
That's a great question. And I think that there's something actually very interesting afoot, which is that at the moment that this exhibition happened, we were still in a kind of AIDS and post-AIDS shock, in which, because there had been so many laws against the representation of sexuality, I mean, these were literally on the books. Jesse Helms made laws that if you wanted to get federal funding for an exhibition, you couldn't talk about sexuality. So we were always playing with code. We were always suggesting without saying. Works were avoiding direct political statement. And now that's out the window. And people are making aggressively political statements. And I think this is a cycle. You know, we constantly sort of move between positions of being aggressively political and quietly so. But I think we're now in an aggressively political moment, which makes this show actually very, very interesting as a counterpoint, because it seems in comparison so quiet.
Well, you know, and I'm going to paraphrase a question from our colleague Randy Griffey from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who points out that the Marsden Hartley's Maine at the Met Breuer was quite a queer show. Are there some artists who, you know, over the years have, you know, you mentioned, you know, Bellows being kind of cast into this kind of, you know, perma-straightness, you know, if you will. Are there some artists who, you know, because of the scholarship on them, you know, where things have changed, where exhibitions can now be mounted in ways differently than the past?
One of the things, and it was a criticism we heard when the show opened, was it's not that Jonathan and I aren't original thinkers, but this was based on a tremendous amount of other work by people like Jonathan Weinberg and the other Katz and other people like that. And what we heard from a lot of the professoriate was, well, this is old news. We've heard all this. And it's like, yeah, you've heard it at the art history department at Delaware, but the museum going public at the Smithsonian in particular, or at Tacoma, Washington, where it traveled last, they have not heard this argument. They don't know anything about Marsden Hartley. They don't even know who any of this is. So again, there's this disjuncture and a lag time between academic culture, academic research, and museum culture. It's inevitable that this is going to percolate out, partly because it takes so much time to do both books and then shows, that there's a call and response between the two disciplines. So yeah, I mean, but you have to make that distinction in terms of what is allowable or what is shown in exhibitions, being a little bit retardative.
And I think also that one of the things that's interesting is that there are a certain number of artists about whom you can now address questions of sexuality. And certainly Marsden Hartley's one of them. And that show did do that. But what's telling still is that you cannot find questions of sexuality interwoven into the traditional telling of the story of American art, which is what we wanted to do. We wanted to make the question of American art and the question of sexuality deeply familiar, and in that, I don't think we've succeeded.
No. You don't think so?
No, but it was a hell of a good effort.
Yeah. What is there anything, so, going off another question, was there anything that you left out that, any objects that you would have wanted to have in the exhibition?
As I said, that we didn't get a big Rauschenberg. I also have to point out the irony, which again, I don't think anybody noticed, that the exhibition is titled after a Pavel Tilichev painting at MoMA, which MoMA wouldn't loan us. So we stole the title anyway and said, oh, well, okay.
Too late.
The original title piece was going to be Tilichev's hide and seek, and I actually think we were craftier because we used the virgule, the slash, so it's hide seek, so that boundary line is even more opaque. It's not hide and seek; it's an element of constant interplay back and forth between hiding and seeking. So, and
we wanted that Tilichev painting not only because it's got sexuality at the very center, but it was voted in 1948 the most popular painting in America.
Right. So bad luck to you, MoMA.
So we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to wrap up with a question about the impact. We've talked about the impact on the museum world, but also on academia, on university practice, for teaching. One of our participants writes in, saying that they recently taught a class on race, gender, and sexuality in contemporary art. And the class spent a whole day just on hide-seek. And, they were able, I imagine this is a seminar class meeting once a week. And so if you have 12 weeks to spend, 10% of the class on this exhibition, that's huge, right? It's huge for these students to have been able to engage the catalog. And, as you will have seen through the presentation, we've been showing shots from the actual physical catalog. And it's been incredibly impactful. So Jonathan, I'll give you the last word here to talk about how the teaching of American art, the teaching of contemporary art, how you feel this piece of, outstandingly incredible, amazing, wonderful scholarship has changed that direction, has changed the flow.
And I think that the book is, in many respects, one of the most valued aspects of this exhibition because it's going to be around. And the scholarship will remain. It may be contested, it may be updated, but it's going to remain. I think that what we are going to see happening, and we see this all the time, museums do not lead the American public, they follow. And when through scholarship, through university classes, through art history, we have successfully changed the picture of American art and made it clear that sexuality is part of that story, then I think we will eventually find that museums have no choice but to pick up the thread and to change business as usual. And that's the day I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, me too. Well, I want to thank you both for being with me today. It was really great to have this conversation. I want to thank everybody who attended. Jackie, can you give me the last slide, please? I want to put a special plug. Let's go through, a special plug. On July 7th, again, we'll have another program that's focused on 2 artists who participated in the National Portrait Gallery's Identify Performance Art Series. Jeffrey Gibson, recent MacArthur Genius grant winner, and the artist Maria Magdalena Campos Pons will be in conversation with Dorothy Moss. So I hope you come back and join me and Dorothy, Jeffrey, and Maria. Maria Magdalena, or Magda as she's known to friends, for this conversation. So thank you so much and have a good evening.
Thank you, Gwen.
Thanks so much.